I'd like to bring up a different way of reading Akedat Yitzchak, the binding of Isaac, than we usually think of. Because I think sometimes when we're reading Torah, when we're reading Tanakh, it can be useful to read the text in a way where the idea that HaKadosh Baruch Hu can speak to people is a premise of the text, and we don't consider how that's supposed to work. And we take for granted that if the text tells us that Hashem spoke to someone, that he did, and they heard him. And then the question is, how do they act when they're being told something by the king and creator of the world? And there's plenty to understand by reading things in that way. But I think there's another way of looking at it, which is to say that if a Navi hears the voice of Hashem telling him to do something, that's not a separate thing from the intellect and the reason of the Navi, and that's not a separate thing from his ability to look at the facts of his situation and make an inference about what God might want him to do based on his understanding, let's say, of the Torah or understanding of Hashem's ways. To put it another way, there is a way to understand the way Tanakh or the Torah is talking about things when it says Vayomer Hashem El Avram or something like that it's kind of giving us a compression or a distillation of what's going on, right? That Avram may actually be looking at a concrete situation and filtering his knowledge of the world through his ability to reason and through his tefillot, his prayers to Hashem, through his seeing what happens. When you're talking about other people throughout Tanakh, it's easier to say also they're bringing in their knowledge of the Torah. Even in the case of Avraham, maybe you could say, Chazal certainly impute knowledge of the Torah to the Avot. But the point is that that's not just a megaphone booming in your head with the voice that you know is the voice of Hashem. That's you're realizing Hashem is telling you to do something by taking stock and thinking and praying and looking what happens and iterating that process and coming to a conclusion. And in that view, Nevuah is about a relationship between the Navi and HaKadosh Baruch Hu that's based in the faculties of the human being to make inferences based on evidence and a sequence of occurrences, along with some set of guiding principles or statements where they know something that's true about Hashem, perhaps from the Torah. So if you read it in that way, I think what's interesting then to say is that if we go to Akedat Yitzchak with Avraham Avinu, instead of reading the story as a booming megaphone speaks into Avraham's head and tells him, go make an olah of Yitzchak, make an elevation offering of Yitzchak. Instead, we could ask, why would Avram decide that it was the will of Hashem that he kill Yitzchak? How could that possibly be the conclusion that he came to, especially given that he knew about HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that human sacrifice, child sacrifice is anathema, is the worst thing ever, right? How could Avram be so confused as to think that that's what Hashem wanted from him? And you see how the premise that Hashem can just speak into your ear and it's him, that removes that challenge, because it just is, it seems like something he wouldn't say, but if he said it, then he said it, and now you have to deal with it. And there's plenty of value in reading the Akedah, the binding of Isaac, that way. But if we read it instead as the Nevuah of Avraham is a processing of the world being done by his intellect through his relationship to and knowledge of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, then we have to ask ourselves, how on earth could Avraham have come to the conclusion that it had somehow become the will of Hashem that he sacrifice Yitzchak? And I think that this ultimately also redounds to the question of why Har Moriah becomes Har Habayit. Why is the place of Akedat Yitzchak eventually going to be the place where Har HaBayit is chosen or is identified by David. And of course, we have all this midrashic tradition that, oh, well, Evan Shtiyah, there's a stone there which is the sort of foundation stone of the world, and you can trace it all back to Gan Eden. And yes, if you want, you can read midrashim and see a much richer structure of narratives that are feeding into this moment. But at some level, we can look at the Mishkan, the tabernacle, this portable proto-temple structure that's built in the desert, according to the Torah, as being a way of relating to Hashem that doesn't have a fixed location. Eventually, once David builds or prepares to build Beit HaMikdash, and then Shlomo builds Beit HaMikdash on Har HaBayit, that becomes, according to the Halacha, the permanent location of the temple, and you can't switch back to a Mishkan afterwards. So if it was portable before, then how does it become permanent, and why does it become permanent in that one place? Like, why that place of all places? There are a lot of places that maybe David or Shlomo could have selected. And one way of, or let's say another way of putting it is Har HaBayit Har Moriah because it so happened that David chose that place, and because that was the place that David chose, that therefore becomes a place of greater significance? And then you make the argument of the permanence all having to do with the sort of eternity of the dynasty of David that's promised to David. But if he had chosen a different location, then we would have a permanent temple in a different location. Or did David, in a sense, have to choose Har Moriah because it was Har Moriah, that the place of Akedat Yitzchak made it the appropriate place to build a temple? And maybe that's only one factor. There might be other factors that make it, the place that's chosen. But it's really interesting to think of it in those terms, because then you kind of get more the sense of, if the ultimate goal of the Torah always, which is implicit in Psukim and Sefer Dvarim, about how there's supposed to be this place that Hashem will choose to make his name dwell there, right? If ultimately the arc of the Torah is leading towards the selection of a permanent capital for Shalosh Regalim, for the pilgrimages of the festivals every year, or many years out of 7, and for the sacrifices to be happening and everything, right? If that's the way the arc is going, then there is going to be a sense in which the fulfillment of that intention of the Torah is going to be connected to the qualities of the place that was selected. It wasn't just that, we could have stayed portable forever. It so happened that David felt guilty about having a house of cedar and wanting to build a house of cedar for Hashem. Shlomo and David, felt bad, so they built a house for Hashem. And now that they did that, then it becomes permanent. But if they hadn't done that, then it wouldn't have. If instead we view it as the point of the Torah is that, yes, eventually you want to really try to build a more permanent structure, then in a sense, the narrative leading up to the point where Shlomo selects, or David selects and Shlomo builds on Har HaBayit, leading up to that point, that's the process of figuring out how to get there, in a sense. And that there is a need to gradually come to the conclusion that this is the appropriate place, right? That there's a kind of a realization that needs to gradually happen in the consciousness of the nation that ultimately settles on Har Moriah for some reason, that takes us back to the Akedah and says, okay, if Akedat Yitzchak is the place where, if that happened in Har Moriah, it's something about the characteristics of that event provide the appropriate vessel for what Beit HaMikdash is meant to become. So I think that now brings us to this way of reading the story with Avraham, because again, if you read the story as Hashem is just showing you everything, then it remains kind of arbitrary, right? Avram was also just following Hashem's instructions. And Hashem told him, okay, this mountain, it's going to be here. And then later he showed David with an angel, it's going to be here. And it always is kind of Hashem's holding the cards and he's just telling people what to do. But if instead, again, it's somehow kind of processed through reason, like that in order for Abraham to hear Hashem telling him it's going to be here, it has to be something that he appreciates about the place. What could he have appreciated about the place? Why would it be that the place where Akedat Yitzchak took place was somehow apparent to Avram as being the appropriate one for him to do what Hashem was commanding him? How do you know to go there and not somewhere else? What would that mean? So that's another kind of question. There are a lot of different things that we can bring up in the course of this discussion. So I think, first of all, to close out maybe some of the basics and the points that we're just raising, a simpler version, before we open up this whole thing of why sacrifice Yitzchak, what is this about killing Yitzchak? Before we open that up, we can just notice about the name and also the sort of use of the place, two things that are connected to the temple, right? That it's called, in the time of Abraham, seemingly, Eretz HaMoriah. Moriah, that sounds like something that already sort of is aware of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, right? Mor is myrrh, it's an ingredient in the incense, and to have a name of Hashem attached to Mor, it sounds like something we're going to be doing in the temple. We're going to be burning incense in the temple on Har Bayit, and Moriah already kind of appreciates that. This is a mountain of myrrh for Hashem. And so I think one direction you can go in here is that this was not an arbitrary place. This wasn't just some hill that was totally indistinguishable to anyone other than someone with a prophetic sort of special goggle set that reveals a sort of fiery arrow pointing at this one mountain that Avram sees but no one else would see. There is maybe already kind of a reference to the idea that here in Eretz Canaan, there's a place where there's some awareness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu that needs all of Am Yisrael and the Torah to develop before that's happening. And of course, we see that elsewhere in the life of Avram, right? Earlier on, there's this whole thing with Malki Tzedek, Melech Shalem, the king of Shalem. Malki Tzedek is kind of a priest. He's called the Kohen of El Elyon, the most high God. Koneh Shamayim Va'aretz, the one who possesses heaven and earth, right? So he's a priest of Hashem who is, after Avram rescues the people of Stone from Kedor HaOmer and Nimrod, midrashically, that there is this priest from Shalem, where we're told midrashically that Shalem is the Shalayim of Yerushalayim, right? That Malki Tzedek is a priest of Hashem who's there in Eretz Canaan somehow and serving this sort of pastoral role. And so you already have the sense of there's biblical monotheism going on before the Bible in Canaan somehow. And of course, the Midrash tells us that Malki Tzedek is Shem, the son of Noach. And what it's trying to do there is it's trying to say, look, if Noach was a biblical monotheist, then so too could have been his son, and there could have been a pre-existing tradition of worship of Hashem that was passed down through generations that wasn't something that Avram had to sort of discover or invent himself. Maybe he rediscovered it, or maybe he was a part of and connected to that lineage in some way. But the point is that Malki Tzedek represents the idea that something is already going on here. And we don't necessarily have an obvious way of saying, okay, and this is also Har Moriah. Shalem and Har Moriah are the same thing. We don't get that in an obvious form. But the fact that Moriah is named what it's named, it fits into the notion of there is worship of HaKadosh Baruch Hu going on somewhere, and that maybe actually was associated even before David conquered from the Yevusim, Yerushalayim. It may have been associated during some period with the area of Yerushalayim, and in particular Har HaBayit. And the other thing we know, at the time of the Yevusim anyway, is that Har HaBayit is a goren, it's a threshing floor. And the threshing floor is where you're going to kind of find out how bountiful your harvest is. And so, you might imagine for the Yevusim, it was a place where they would do some avodah zarah to try to, wave some magic and make sure their harvest is plentiful. So, it comes to kind of underlining that our harvest and all bounty that comes to us from the land is ultimately going to be up to HaKadosh Baruch Hu to determine. And so we want to take a place that previously was about either through a technical means like threshing or through associated charms and tricks of local paganism, one way or another, that it was about trying yourself to tilt the odds in your own favor, taking that and sort of steamrolling it and replacing it and saying, no, now what this place is for proper relationship to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, because that's the thing you actually need to keep in good shape if you want to have a bountiful harvest. And you, in addition, have to not just use worship of Hashem as an apparent means to give yourself a better harvest, because if you try to do that, that's going to be avodah zarah, and it's going to fail, and you'll be right back where you started. So those are the things that we know about Har HaBayit that might have kind of argued in its favor, just without any examination of the question of why Yitzchak is being involved in this. That there may have been some kind of a place that was a proto Beit Mikdash that already was associated with, Semite biblical monotheism from the line of Shem, Malki Tzedek, whatever, down from Noach, that was really about connecting to the one true God of the world, and that might have been a place that Avram felt compelled to go to because he had some kind of point to make where it wasn't enough to just pray to Hashem or build a mizbeach somewhere in Eretz Canaan. He wanted to somehow connect to Hashem or make an argument to Hashem that he needed that place for. Okay, so that's the kind of the working hypothesis now, and that it's because it was a Moriah, it was a Har Moriah, it was a mountain of incense for the Lord. There was already a place that had that kind of designation. So if we keep working with that idea, now the question we have to ask is, why is Avram trying to kill Yitzchak? And I think there are a few different pieces to try to put together there. One of them is about this word akedah, the binding. Like it says, akod, that he bound Yitzchak. And we just translate it as bound and move on. But really the word akod or akud elsewhere in the Torah seems to mean something different. There's a lot of association with sheep, first of all. Second of all, there's maybe the association with markings on the sheep. We have that from Rashi, and we also have it seemingly, apparently, from this passage where Yaakov Avinu is trying to breed sheep to have speckles and spots and things, which we'll get into more in detail in a second. So the point is, there's already kind of an ambiguity that's a bit puzzling there, because in the context of the Akedah, we need it to mean that he's tying up Yitzchak, which kind of on its own doesn't make a lot of sense. Because if, in fact, he's doing what he's doing, he either doesn't need to tie up Yitzchak because there is a sort of willing participant on the other side of the equation, that Yitzchak knows what he's doing, as we have from the Midrash, or he sort of needs the same strength to overpower someone who's fighting him to tie him up as he needs to kill him. So why? I don't know. Maybe you could argue that he has to tie him up first in order to have decorum or whatever for a sacrifice. But there's no mention of a struggle. So then why does he need to tie him up? Why does he need to sort of wrap him in some way? So there's plenty of puzzle around the word akedah or wayachod. And then also, I think in general, we have to ask back to the beginning of what we were starting with. Why would Avram, if he's reasoning about what Hashem wants in the world, why would he say, okay, I think, this is implausible because Hashem doesn't like to have human sacrifice, but I just feel forced to the conclusion that this is the only thing that he could be asking. How could he possibly come to that conclusion? And so there are a few other details that start to bring this a little bit more into focus. One of them is after Akedat Yitzchak. So at the end of Akedat Yitzchak, after everything is over, and Yitzchak is not killed, Avram goes back to his place, and then it just adds, "Vayhi acharei hadvarim ha'eleh, vayugad le'Avraham le'emor, hine yalda milka gam hi banim le'Nahor ahicha." And it came to pass, after these things, it was told to Avram, "Behold, Milcah, she has also borne children to your brother Nahor." So he gets some, family greeting card that tells him about different people who were born, and from this he finds out about the existence of Rivka. And then we view that as just a setup to Parshat Chayei Sarah, where Avram is going to be looking for a spouse for Yitzchak. But it is a bit odd that it appears here, because the next thing that happens is that Sarah Imenu dies, and then we're dealing with burying Sarah Imenu, and then we get to return to the question of finding a wife for Yitzchak. But it's put here, right after the Akedah. And the other thing is, when we start the Akedah off, it begins with Vayhi ahar hadvarim ha'eleh. And after these things came to pass, Elohim nisa et Avraham, vayomer elav Avraham, vayomer hineni. Right? And God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham, and he said, behold, here I am. So, what things? Vayhi ahar hadvarim ha'eleh. And so it was after these things came to pass. What things were those? Of course, we have the Midrashim that say, there were these 10 tests that Hashem made for Avraham, and, like Nimrod threw him in the fire, etc. You can always fill all of that in if you want, but in Chumash itself, it's not there. And we don't usually think of it as being connected to the pasuk that immediately precedes it, but I want to argue now it could actually be connected to that. The immediately preceding pasuk is, V'yagar Avraham be'eretz plishtim yamim rabim. Okay, Avraham has just made this brit, this covenant with Abimelech, the leader of the Plishtim. Beersheba is in the south, near Aza, near Eretz Gerar, the land of the Plishtim. And he makes enough of a peace with them with this brit of the 7 ewes at the well. 7 ewes already, it's like, I think we've argued at another point, 7 female sheep at a well. It reminds of when Moshe met Zipporah at the well, saving the daughters of Yitro, and he ultimately got married from that. So there's a little bit of an atmosphere of marriage in the air if we know the rest of the Torah. And then Avram lived in Eretz Plishtim for many years. If he's living in Eretz Plishtim, perhaps his son, Yitzchak, who was also going to hang out in Beersheba, perhaps he also is living for many years in Eretz Plishtim. And there you start to say, okay, so the Akedah ends with, here's some news that might be relevant to finding a wife for Yitzchak. And at the beginning, after these things, Avram is tested and he decides he has to, do this thing with Yitzchak. What is the test? What provokes Avram to this conclusion? Something to do with living for many years in the land of the Plishtim. And then we get some help really underlining this possibility, because you could start to speculate about it on your own, which is that, okay, maybe there's kind of an issue with assimilation going on here, that Avram came to Eretz Canaan, he's going to have to find a wife for Yitzchak. We know the end of that story. He finds a wife for Yitzchak outside of the land of Israel. But right now he just spent many years living in the land of Israel in a fairly friendly relationship with Plishtim, who are the Goyim in his vicinity, right? So his son is growing up in that environment, perhaps. And if so, one has to worry maybe eventually he's going to be tempted to take a wife from among the Plishtim. Now, if that's the case, then we'll have to explain a bit more, but the hypothesis becomes Avram does not want Yitzchak to marry the women of the Plishtim, but he feels trapped, right? It's like, okay, so what, am I supposed to tell him not to get married? Then I may as well be killing him, right? Like I'm if I don't let him marry, then I am keeping my faith with Hashem, but I'm making a sacrifice out of him in a sense, because I'm ruining his life. I'm preventing him from procreating. I'm preventing him from having, a real life in the place that he's being allowed to live. And those seem to be the two choices. So that's the kind of, argument that Avram wants to be making, and we can develop that more in a second. But the point is, the hypothesis is Avram sees what he's doing with the Akedah is somehow being connected with the fact that he doesn't want Yitzchak to marry Plishti women. And then eventually the solution comes after the Akedah, which is, okay, you can get a woman from outside of the land of Israel. Now, that sounds like it fits a bit of what you see in the text, but what really makes it clear is Sefer Shoftim, the book of Judges, and the story of Shimshon. Because others have enumerated many details. There's a great shiur on Aleph Beta about this, but you don't really need that many of them to make it click for this purpose. There's a lot in the story of Yitzchak that's connected with the story of Shimshon. They both originate from a woman who's barren and can't have a child, but then a malach, an angel, comes and says, no, you're going to have a child. There is also in Yitzchak's life a time when he is blind. Ditto with Shimshon. There's a time when he is blind. He explains that his strength comes from not shaving his hair. And so he talks about a razor will not pass over my head. So the word for razor there is Moriah, and Moriah is like Moriah. So it's like a knife being waved at him that is connected with the notion of Moriah or Moriah. So maybe it's also a reference to the Akedah. But when Shimshon is blinded also, everyone, the Plishtim are mocking him. And so the verb of mocking is the same as the root of the name of Yitzchak. So there's a lot of different little bits you can line up. And I think it makes it a much stronger case that you say, oh, where did Shimshon live again? He defied his parents and went and found a Plishti wife in Aza, right? In exactly that area of west of Beersheba, Eretz Gerar, what then became eventually Aza, right? So the land of the Plishtim, described as Gerar in the time of Avimelech and Avraham. So more explicitly, what we have in the example of Shimshon is a rebellious son who chooses to marry a Plishti woman, and that ultimately leads to his ruin. But along the way, he becomes blind, like Yitzchak is going to become blind. And there are other, parallels that are piling up. And that helps us to think about Yitzchak in this way and say, okay, I'm starting to see a possibility here, which is that Yitzchak is reaching an age where he wants to get married. He's been growing up in this Plishti society, basically, or next to it. And he looks around him, and how's he supposed to get married? This is what there is. There are Plishti women here. So I'm going to take a Plishti wife. And Avram is not living in the time of Shimshon. Doesn't even make sense to say, no, marry your own people. Who are his own people? There are no people that are his own people. It's just him. So what choice does he have? And that's what brings you to the point where this is really about Avram's reason, right? What is Avram trying to do when he takes Yitzchak to Har Moriah for a sacrifice? When they're walking up the mountain, Yitzchak says to him, Ayeh aseh le'olah, where is the lamb for the offering? And Avram doesn't say, don't ask questions, just keep walking. And he doesn't say that I'm going to kill you or something, very direct. He says that Hashem will see for himself the lamb, my son, right? And you have to really read this carefully and flesh out different possible readings. So it's Vayomer Avraham Elohim yir'eh lo haseh le'ora beni v'yilchu shneim yahdav. And Avram said, my son, God will provide himself a lamb for a burnt offering. That's how it's usually translated. But it's Elohim yir'eh lo haseh le'ora. God will see lo for himself haseh le'olah beni. That could be haseh le'olah beni. He will see for himself the lamb for the offering is my son. So, in that view, this is Avram trying to make a point to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, right? What is he saying to HaKadosh Baruch Hu? He's saying, you have given me this mission, right? And it is a mission to transform the world, starting with one family that's going to walk from one end of this land to another for a few generations and eventually inherit it, right? While doing that, we have to show our commitment to you. And that means we shouldn't be building a family based on idolatry and constantly marrying Canaanites who bring Canaanite idolatry into the family. And Plishtim, maybe you could say, are not Canaanites, but it's the same kind of issue, right? They're a little bit more Egyptian genealogically. And maybe that's why Avram is more willing to flirt with the idea, because maybe Egyptians are somehow a bit better than Canaanites. But the point in any case is there's something too Chamite about the Plishtim. And Avram feels, on the one hand, like, I can't let Yitzchak marry any of these women because that will defeat the whole purpose of what we're doing. Our family project is for the sake of Hashem. And if he marries into a family that's just going to bring idols into the home, then this is over. And there's no point to it. On the other hand, Yitzchak has to get married and he has to have children. And Avram feels like he's being presented with two options, both of which are unacceptable. And that starts to sound a lot like the Akedah, right? The Akedah is, do you obey the command of Hashem and perform the human sacrifice? Or do you obey the command of Hashem and refuse to do human sacrifice? Because both of those things are commands of Hashem, right? In this one narrative. So the version of this that maintains the idea of this paradoxical dilemma of the divine command is to say, go to Canaan and build a family and sort of take it over gradually, but also keep yourselves pure, keep yourselves monotheistic and committed to worship of HaKadosh Baruch Hu and all of these things that are impossible to do if you're going to build a family. So Avram wants to make a point to HaKadosh Baruch Hu and say, look, you have put me in an impossible situation and I am calling your bluff. So how does he call his bluff? He says, look, this is the situation that you have created. You have put my son on an altar for sacrifice, because what you're saying is you've created him in the world, but I am to prevent him from getting married and having a life. And so you're asking me to sacrifice him to you and my commitment to you. And the way I will show that to you is I will say, this is in your hands. If you gave him to me, but then you create a framework of requirements that effectively is like killing him as far as the life you're allowing him to lead, then take him back, right? Then you've already decided to take him back. So admit that and take him back. And of course, Avraham doesn't want Yitzchak to be taken back. He wants to say to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, look at the position you've put me in, admit that you have to decide between the horns of this dilemma, because it's a dilemma of your creation. Now, that maybe sounds somewhat plausible, but it's still certainly assembled from a lot of different pieces that come from different places, and it might seem like it doesn't fully hang together yet. But now, where do we go with this? Well, for one thing, we still have to kind of make sense of this verb, ya'akod, like the binding of Yitzchak. If this is just a demonstration to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, then why does it need, tying up of Yitzchak? And also, it would be nice if we could see some other indications that this theory has support elsewhere in the text. So one thing I think maybe the first kind of one-off indication that we're on the right track is when Avram ultimately is told by the Malach, don't kill Yitzchak. It's Vayomer al tishlah yadcha el hanar ve'al ta'as lo me'uma ki ata yada'ati ki yareh Elohim ata ve'lo hasahta et bincha et yehidcha mimeni. You did not, and he said, don't send forth your hand towards the lad and don't do anything to him, because now I know that you are God-fearing and you have not withheld your son, your only one, from me. But this word me'uma is interesting. Don't do anything to him. Al ta'aslo me'uma. Where else does me'uma appear? Well, the next two appearances of me'uma are both relevant and interesting. First of all, me'uma appears when Yaakov is negotiating with Lavan about his wages, when it's about to be the whole episode with the flocks of sheep that are speckled and spotted. And so, right next to this word me'uma, in an adjacent pasuk, you're going to have the word akodim. Right? So, we were looking for an explanation of what does this word akod really mean? Well, Akudim appears a few psukim down, and we'll get into that in detail in a second. So this is connected somehow to the Akedah. The verb Ya'akod doesn't appear elsewhere in the Torah, really. There's Beta Eked in the time of Yehu, in Tanakh. So there's definitely, elsewhere referring to connecting it with sheep. But here, in Chumash itself, it's basically in these two places that you get Ayin, Kuf, Dalet. So that's one interesting indication that Me'uma is connecting to the puzzle we're still trying to solve. Also, the next one is interesting because Me'uma then appears with Potiphar and Yosef, right? Yosef is in the house of Potiphar, and it says, V'ya'azov kol asher lo biyad Yosef v'lo yada'a ito Me'uma. Ki im alechem asher hu ochel wahi Yosef yefeh toar ve'yefeh mar'eh. And he left all that he had in Yosef's hand, and he knew not what he had save for the bread which he ate. And Yosef was handsome and good-looking. And then the word me'uma appears again in connection with the wife of Potiphar. Einenu gadol babayit hazeh mimeni v'lo hasach mimeni me'uma ki im otach ba'asher at ishto. ואיך אעשה הרעה הגדולה הזאת, וחטאתי לאלוהים. There is none greater in this house than I, nor has he kept back anything from me, but you, because you are his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? Well, it's interesting, because not only does the word me'uma appear here, but also the word hasach, this word of withholding, right? Like, ata yadati ki yareh Elohim ata v'lo hasachta. You didn't withhold your son, your only one, from me. So you have me'uma and you have hasach appearing next to each other. And what is this about? This is about a dalliance with a foreign woman, right? This is about Yosef, the son of Yaakov, being in a foreign land and being tempted to get involved with a woman who will be an inappropriate relationship for him. So that's the thing that we were talking about before with Yitzchak and the Plishtim, right? Which was paralleling what actually does happen with Shimshon. So more confirmation of the associations that we're finding here. But the last thing to really put things into place is this idea of Ya'akod. What is Avram doing when he's tying up Yitzchak? And what's interesting is that you look into Rashi, and it is quoted that the meaning of Ya'akod is that it's a marking on the sheep that has to do with where it is being bound. Like, you bound it by its wrists or something, its ankles. And then because it's being bound by its ankles, there's a marking there on it, which is a very funny kind of blend between the two different readings, right? On the one hand, Ya'akod in Akedat Yitzchak classically is translated as, and he bound him. On the other hand, when we get this thing where Yaakov is in this negotiation with Lavan, and he has to sort of try to stack the deck in terms of how these animals are speckled and spotted, then interestingly, the way this proceeds is that first of all, they come to an agreement about the characteristics of the flocks, right? That after this word milma appears, it says, E'evor bechol tzonecha hayom haser misham kol se nakod v'talu v'chol se hom b'ksavim v'talu v'nakod b'izim v'haya schari. I'll pass through your flock today, removing from them all the speckled and spotted cattle, and all the brown cattle among the sheep, and the spotted and speckled among the goats, and of such shall be my hire. So they're agreeing about, what are going to be his wages, right? In all of this, there's no mention of the word akudim. There's just nakod and talu and chum, right? These different things that are maybe colors and stripes and spots and things. Then Lavan removes all the different speckled and spotted things. So it says, "V'yasar beyomahu et hatayeshim ha'akudim v'hataluim v'et kol ha'izim ha'nekudot v'hataluot kol asher Lavan bo v'chol hum b'chzavim v'yiten b'yad banav." Okay, so this is Lavan trying to kind of, be tricky, right? So it's Wayomer Lavan hen lu yehi kedvarecha. He's agreeing to the terms that Yaakov has laid out. Ve'sar beyomahu et hatayeshim ha'akudim ve'atluim ve'et kol ha'izim. So there's now a whole bunch of different kinds of adjectives that are being used for the spots and speckles. That it seems to include the word akudim, and akudim is usually used now to refer to marked. In what now, first of all, Lavan is removing so that he takes it out of the flock of Yaakov, but then Yaakov does his thing with the maklot, with the staves with different stripes and speckles on them. And then when it gets to the point of the mating of the sheep, it's Vayehemu atzon el hamaklot v'taladna hatzon akudim nikodim utluim. And the flocks conceived before the rods and brought forth cattle striped and speckled and spotted. So we're always translating akudim here striped. But why then is Rashi saying, akudim is really striped in a way that refers to markings on the sheep from the way it's been bound? If that's true, then how could it be that this is a trait that just like you give birth to a striped sheep? That doesn't make sense. If it's striped from being bound, that's not a heritable trait. And no one would think it would be. So you could have just said striped. Why is it And I mean, you could say, oh, well, people are just saying they know that Yaakov means, the binding of Yitzchak. So they're just kind of trying to get it to mean both things at once. But it doesn't make sense to get it to mean both things at once if that's nonsense, right? If in order to say that, you have to insist on something that makes no sense. And it's interesting that Aquadim doesn't appear in the first mentioning of all these different traits of the animals. It only appears once people are like shuffling animals around and doing things with them, but it doesn't appear at the point where they're agreeing on the colorings and specklings. There, it's the core things are nikudot and tluot, or nikudim and tluim, or maybe hum also. So the proposal I would want to make is to resolve this by saying that the animals are being bound in order to have them mate. If you don't bind a randy goat, then the randy goat will go and find whatever goat S or U or whatever you want to call the female it wants to mate with, and it will mate with it. And you're not going to have control over who mates with whom that way. If you tie up the males, then you probably have a lot more control over who goes where. And that's exactly what Yaakov is going to be doing, right? But it's more generally probably a practice of, okay, I'm going to keep certain goats during the mating season. I'm going to tie them here. And this will be the pen where I breed goats of this kind. And this will be the pen where I breed goats of that kind. Tried to argue elsewhere, and you could go into more detail about this, that the thing with the rods that Yaakov is doing is he's labeling goats and sheep based on their parentage, right? Their trait is apparent, whether they're speckled or spotted, but they might be white as snow, but have a speckled or spotted parent. So he's keeping track of genetic heredity using these things as labels, and he can get, two white goats to mate who both have parents that are speckled, and then he can get speckled goats, right? It's like you can make the argument he's basically tracking traits on chromosomes, like alleles. It's not the only thing he could be doing. And there are reasonable readings that want to emphasize something else. But one of the things he might be doing is actually practicing a certain kind of sensible genetic modeling for animal husbandry. And if you read it that way, then the akod thing, right? Vayiten pnei hatzon el akod v'chol chum betzon lavan v'yeshet lo adarim levado, right? So he separated the lambs and then set the faces of the flocks towards, it says, the striped, because it's akod, and all the brown of the flock and of lavan. Akod never appears by itself. It always is like there's another trait that's there, and they're also akudim or akod or whatever. And I think that given that it wasn't originally a trait when it was first mentioned and what they agreed on, and then subsequently it always is being mentioned in a list of other traits, I think the point is it's like you have the bound sheep and the unbound sheep, and then you have the sheep that are spotted and not spotted, and the ones you're binding are because this is how you're controlling who goes where, and how you're regulating which sheep mate with which, or which goats mate with which. And if you read it that way, then it makes sense that it's like these are stripes, but they're the stripes of being bound. This is the way that the Rashi is getting at that. It's saying this is about controlling stripiness, but you're doing that with binding. Why is that important? Because this seems now just like we're way in the weeds of an unrelated story where we're just following the verb of Yaakov, but it seems to have nothing to do with the binding of Isaac. And yet, it does. Why does it have to do with the binding of Isaac? Two reasons. First of all, because now that we view things in those terms, we realize that's what we were already accusing Avraham of doing with respect to Isaac's marriage, right? Yitzchak, or Isaac, wants to mate. And Avraham is regulating who it is that gets to mate with Yitzchak, right? He is constraining Yitzchak and preventing him, let's say, from marrying Plishtaite women. And because of that constraint, then, he's not getting married. So the problem we're claiming that is an explanation for this whole situation is one in which Yitzchak is akud. He is bound. And he's bound in the same way that the sheep have been bound. He's been bound by someone who's trying to control whom he's mating with, because that person is concerned about the traits they'll pass on to their children, right? We don't want to pass Canaanite idolatry onto the children, so we have to constrain Yitzchak to not marry the Plishite women. So if we're reading this back into the idea that Avram is doing a big demonstration to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, then maybe he actually ties up Yitzchak literally with ropes or whatever, because it's part of the pageant. It's part of the point he's trying to make. Or maybe not. Maybe it's referring at some other level to the constraints that Avram had set on Yitzchak already. Either way, it fits what's going on here. And the point is, and I should say that the other reason that this fits and this makes sense is more the goats and coats aspect of this. That's a turn of phrase you hear often on Rabbi David Foreman's Aleph Beta. There are many stories that involve kind of dressing up in clothing that comes from sheep and deceiving people as you go through the generations of the Avot. And the most obvious one is where the blessing is being stolen by Yaakov from Esav in front of Yitzchak, where what does Yaakov do? He puts sheepskins on his neck, for example, to seem hairier like Esav. So he's kind of dressing up as a sheep in order to put on a show in which a meal is being offered, right? If you go to what's going on with Avram and Yitzchak at the binding of Isaac, we just said that this word akud doesn't just mean bound, it means bound like a sheep. That there's a sense in which Avram is wrapping up Yitzchak to say he is the lamb. Like you could even imagine him wrapping him in a sheepskin, right? Which, on its own would sound sort of implausible, except that we have, going down through the generations, all of this substitution of sheep for people and wrapping in sheepskins and different kinds of things that happen that follow that pattern. So in this moment, it doesn't say explicitly that he wrapped him in a sheepskin, but on the theory that the presentation that that Avraham is trying to make to HaKadosh Baruch Hu is to say, look, you have made my son a lamb to the slaughter because you're not allowing him to get married, because you're making me not allow him to get married. And that's like making me sacrifice him to you. So I'm going to sacrifice him to you until you stop me. Right? And in order to do that, whether he actually puts a costume on Yitzchak or whether you just sort of read that into the metaphorical thing that's happening here that then parallels the actual putting of sheepskin in the next generation on Yaakov, it certainly is evocative of the idea of bringing a sort of sheepness into the picture, because now this verb of Yaakov doesn't just mean binding; it means binding like a marked sheep. And you make all that argument, and then you come to what happens afterwards, right? Why does Avraham ultimately not take the ma'acheret, this sacrificial knife, which, by the way, has the word of eating in it, which again connects to the food that's being fed to Yitzchak and the next generation, so there's various parallels that connect these two passages together. But at the point where he doesn't slaughter his son, okay, he doesn't slaughter Yitzchak. Why doesn't he slaughter Yitzchak? Because the Malach calls to him and he lifts his eyes, and what does he see? He sees a ram with its horns caught in the thicket. And what are the horns that are caught in the thicket? They are the weapons that rams use to compete with each other over who gets to mate with whom, right? So there's like a ram that wants to mate, so to speak, and it's caught by its two horns in the thicket. So it's like the horns of the dilemma that we were talking about. This animal is stuck because the horns that represent its being a male animal that is in some competition to find a mate, those things have stymied it and trapped it and stuck it in place and ultimately turned it into a sacrifice, right? Because that's what it becomes. So then Avram says, okay, this is HaKadosh Baruch Hu's answer. He's saying, look, here's a ram. The ram is a sacrifice. Why is it a sacrifice? Because it's stuck in place, right? You're telling me there's the horns of this dilemma that you're stuck with. And I'm telling you, what if those horns were not tangled up in one particular location? Then this ram wouldn't still, turn into a sacrifice. So you need to widen your field of view. If you're caught between the horns of a dilemma by saying Yitzhak has to marry here and he's not allowed to marry anyone here, then the way you fix that is that he marries someone who's not here. And that's why the Akedah ends with, oh, here's the news about Rivka, the daughter of Betuel, being over in Padan Aram, and now you can go get her and marry her to Yitzchak. So it's quite elaborate, but there's a lot of different bits of textual evidence that hang together in this kind of a reading, which again, to summarize, is that Avram, like the parents of Shimshon, did not want his son to marry Gazan Philistines. And in his day, there wasn't an option for Yitzchak to marry anyone else. And that may have led to a crisis that reached the point of Avram saying, look, I have to somehow make a point to HaKadosh Baruch Hu about this, because I feel like in order to serve Hashem properly, I'm being asked to make a sacrifice out of my son. And I need to show him that that's what he's asking me to do. And I need to make him show more of his cards. I need to call his bluff. And the way I do that is I take my actual son and I put him on an actual altar and I come within inches of killing him, saying, look, I know that you're in charge of everything. You have put me in this situation. You're responsible for it. You need to show me the solution that will stop me from doing what I'm doing. And because in a sense, I feel that you're already making me make a sacrifice out of him by not giving him a chance to have a family because we're so pure and we're so holy and we're so separate. And that, I think, also is an explanation for why Avraham has to go to Har Moriah. He goes to Har Moriah because if you think about the point that he wants to make, he's thinking about the future of the nation, right? He's saying, this is going to be not just a land for me and my son. It's going to be a land for a nation that's supposed to come from us. And that's what HaKadosh Baruch Hu has promised. So given that that's what he's promised, Yitzchak has to have children. And he has to flourish in the land. And if he is to do that, the point of doing that is that there's one day going to be a national center that's going to be about worshiping Hashem, that extends across the whole land and that has a whole nation that supports and protects and defends it. So Avram could make it an altar anywhere and put Yitzchak on it, and, kill him and set him on fire, right? That you don't have to be in any particular place to do that in the time of Avram. He's always building a mizbeach here and there to serve Hashem. But Har Moriah, where we want to argue, is a pre-existing center of relationship to Hashem in Eretz Canaan. And that represents something bigger than just Avram's relationship to Hashem. That represents the potential for there to eventually be a national center for a nation that is all about Hashem. And that is ultimately Avram's point when he's saying, look, I know the stakes here. I know that I can't just let Yitzchak indulge in marrying whomever he wants, because then the nation expires and dies and is destroyed for that reason. On the other hand, if I don't let him marry, there will be no nation. And there will therefore be no Har HaBayit. There will be no nation that can be the proper custodians of a site of worship of Hashem for all time in this land. And so he has to take Yitzchak to Har Moriah because he already appreciates the potential for the future there, because it would seem perhaps from its name, had some kind of association with worship of Hashem that had a bit of a brand, and that enabled Avram to use it as a symbol in his symbolic pageant that had a sharp point to make with the knife that he brought into it. That he was making a pageant, trusting that HaKadosh Baruch Hu would show him the way to not bring it to completion, because he knows the point is not to kill Yitzchak. But he has to go as close as possible to doing that to get HaKadosh Baruch Hu to open his eyes and show him a sign that means, okay, get those horns untangled from the place that they're stuck in. Don't think about it has to be in this place. There are people outside of this place, and they can be the solution. So that's an elaborate sort of portfolio of evidence and argument. But if we roll it up a bit and step back, I think there's one last thing to say, which is about returning to this question of why Har HaBayit is in the place that it is and what that means, right? Like, if I don't take the trajectory of Judaic history completely for granted, and I say there was supposed to be eventually a permanent site for a temple, but in principle, that place could have been chosen to be different places. So why then is it significant, and how is it significant that it ultimately was chosen to be Har Moriah? On the one hand, you could say, oh, well, maybe that's because Har Moriah was always the place, right? It was the place that there was constant relationship to Hashem since before the time of Avraham. That's one of the things that we've been saying might be the case because of its name. Or you could go in the direction instead and say, the reason that it becomes selected for Har HaBayit is because of what Avram did in Akedat Yitzchak, right? That there's something about the story of Akedat Yitzchak that in the zchut of what Avram did in that moment, that is what we want to immortalize as this will be the eternal place where Hashem is served by his people, right? And I think that's something that is a bit more interesting, because then it sounds less like a historical accident that is not really an explanation, but just begs the question. But instead it's saying that there's real content in what Avram did, and that content is supposed to inform our understanding of what the Beit Mikdash is for. So what did Avram do? Avram had a dilemma that he faced, which was about a variety of different forces that were, let's say, pulling, in opposite directions, but all seemed to be pulling in the direction of serving Hashem. That on the one hand, Avram thinks that his purpose is to create a nation, so he has to have a son, and his son has to have children. There has to be continuity. It has to be an opportunity down through the generations to create the nation that's going to serve Hashem on this mountain. And so this is about Avram's commitment to that national continuity, and that's part of what Har-Bayit is about. But at the same time, it's also about Avram saying, all of that is only worth anything to me because it is what Hashem wants me to do, and it is what Hashem wills to be the case. And if it's not what Hashem wills to be the case, then you give it back to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And Avram is being asked, in a sense, to do that at a level of abstraction. It starts with, take, your son, your only one, the one you love, Yitzchak. And different midrashim talk about, why it is that you have this whole long list. Why not just take Yitzchak? Yitzchak is a particular person, right? But first listing all these other characteristics, it's deliberately abstract. It's saying, look, they're the different components of what Avram is being asked to give up here. He's being asked to give up having a son, something that he created, right? Something that's about the future impact of him on the world. Then there's also the fact that it's his yichid, his only one, meaning that it's about his feeling that this is the only way for me to succeed in doing what I'm trying to do. And asher ahavta, right? That you love, because in addition, he has all this personal, emotional investment. He cherishes his son. He loves his son, right? So there are all these different things where it's saying, look, take what you've created in the world that you think is your only chance to do what Hashem wants you to do, and that you cherish and are proud of and have relationship with and personal and sentimental attachment to. Take that and be willing to let go of it all if it's not what Hashem wants you to be doing, right? That it only has actual worth if HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, this is what you should be doing. And the point is that, of course, HaKadosh Baruch Hu doesn't want human sacrifice. And that's apparent in the story by the end. And really, it's obvious from the beginning and obvious from the greater context of the Torah. So the list kind of gives you these abstract qualities saying, bottom line, Hashem doesn't want Yitzchak to be killed. What he wants is for Avram to be willing to give up that which he has created, that which he thinks is his only means to succeed in serving Hashem, that which he has sentimental attachment to, that which he cherishes, right? We all get asked to do those things, to give those things up sometimes, and, not while doing human sacrifice, thankfully. So ultimately, the point is, don't kill Yitzchak. That's never what Hashem wants. He doesn't want you to do child sacrifice or human sacrifice, but he does want Avram to show that he understands that all these things that are ways in which he assigns value to something, they all have to only have that value if it is in service of what Hashem is asking of him. Because all of his success and all that he has created and all that he cherishes has come to him from Hashem. And so if HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, no, not this way, then Avram cannot argue with that. And that is the characteristic of Avram that Har-Bayit is trying to immortalize, right? It's that, on the one hand, for all the reasons we mentioned, it's that your children are the future of the nation. They are the way in which you have, perhaps your greatest impact on the world in service of Hashem. And you have, obviously, this tremendous personal attachment of love and affection. And with all that being said, there has to be some understanding that all of this really is a way HaKadosh Baruch Hu has enabled me to serve him. That has to be the attitude of the Jewish parent, right? That the children are not your possessions. They're not just presents for you to do with what you wish. They are a means HaKadosh Baruch Hu is giving you to serve him in the world through the way you cherish them, through the way you cultivate them into adulthood, through the way you teach them, and all of that. And so the point at which Avram is given an opportunity to show that he understands that order of priority, that on the one hand, the transmission from one generation to the next is what this is all about, and that is the greatest treasure that you have is, your opportunity to serve Hashem this way, and, that your children are your greatest treasure and all of these things, but that you understand that all of that is this means that HaKadosh Baruch Hu has created for you to have a relationship with him, and that even though he would never actually ask it to be the sacrifice itself, that he wants your understanding of that order of priority to be clear in the way that you serve him, because also it will redound to how you raise them and everything else. And that's the thing that Har HaBayit is about. It's about the generational continuity, and it's about the prioritization of service of Hashem above all other considerations in an ultimate sense. And if you get those things right, then that's how you're going to make a success out of serving HaKadosh Baruch Hu on his mountain. And so we have to make the permanent place for his temple to be the place where Avram achieved that highest level of a commitment to serving Hashem, not just through himself, but through his relationship to his family.